In a recent visit to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Belgium's King Philippe admitted that his country's rule over the Congo was unjustifiable and racist. But the king stopped short of offering an apology. Belgium's colonial reign over the Congo was characterized by economic exploitation, torture, and millions of deaths. The Belgian-backed murder of Congolese independence hero Patrice Lumumba exacerbated colonial atrocities. Brussels is now coming to terms with its dark past in the DRC, which still reels from decades of misrule. So what is Belgium's legacy in the DRC? And moving forward, what does the future hold for DRC and its relations with Belgium? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, the gruesome murder of Congo's independence Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba in January of 1961 set the DRC on a decades-long era of dictatorship, civil war, and economic plunder. It would be revealed years later that Lumumba's death was sanctioned by former colonial power Belgium, aided by the US government. The independence hero's remains were repatriated to the DRC in June of this year and laid to rest in Kinshasa, a ceremony that coincided with the country's Independence Day celebrations. Chris Ochamringa filed this report.
A grand funeral for the DRC's national hero, Patrice Emery Lumumba, more than 60 years in the making. Hundreds of people gathered at the Échangeur Square in Kinshasa to pay tribute to the country's first prime minister. The event was attended by the president of Congo-Brazzaville, Denis Sassou Nguesso, diplomats, and senior Congolese officials.
La présente cérémonie.
This ceremony of laying the remains of our national hero that I am presiding over today is not just an ordinary ritual. It is an event meant to awaken our collective memory about Patrice Lumumba's contribution to our country. It's also an affirmation of our ability to make our nation great.
Patrice Lumumba was killed by firing squad in January 1961 by rebels backed by Belgian mercenaries. He was a leading voice in his country's liberation struggle.
In our country, people with the character of Lumumba are very rare. I don't think they have even been born yet. That's why we keep saying Congo is Lumumba's nation. It's thanks to him that we got independence.
Lumumba's body is reported to have been cut into pieces and dissolved in acid. His tooth is believed to be all that's left. It was recently handed back to his family by Belgium. The return of Lumumba's remains has been hailed as the start of reconciliation between Belgium and the DRC. Belgium's colonial rule in the DRC was brutal. Historians estimate that 10 million people were killed during the reign of King Leopold II.
Now that his remains have been brought back home, the ancestral spirits are happy. That will open lots of opportunities for the country. But we should find ways of improving our trade relations with Belgium.
The funeral was held on the DRC's 62nd independence anniversary. The remains of Patrice Lumumba have finally been laid to rest in this mausoleum 61 years after his assassination. His burial has brought joy to many Congolese who have been demanding the return of his relic from Belgium for a dignified burial back home. Chris Ochamringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Well, let's bring in our guests now from Kinshasa. Joining us via Zoom, Amory Kalema Patrice Lumumba, a conflict transformation professional specializing in human rights and transitional justice. He's also the grandson to the late Prime Minister of the DRC, Patrice Lumumba. Professor Philip Clark is joining us from London. He's a professor of international politics at SOAS University of London, where he's also the co-director at the Center on Conflict, Rights and Justice. Dr. Kandala Lupuana is joining the conversation from Johannesburg. He's a lecturer and PhD researcher on public international law at the University of Johannesburg. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on the program today and being a part of this discussion. Emery, if I may start off with you, Patrice Lumumba's tooth. The only remains of the former Congolese Prime Minister, assassinated in 1961, was returned to his family on June the 20th for burial in the DRC. How do you, as a grandson of the late Lumumba, and your larger family feel about this moment?
Well, right now we are feeling great. A lot of different emotions going on right now. To see such a figure coming back to his country after all this time. So as a family, I can say that we have emotional closure, which is different than justice closure. That's another discussion. But since your question was about the family, we are relieved as a family because what needs to be done when someone passed away, we have customs, we have rights, we have different types of things that allow the spirit to stop wandering and to go peacefully. In his in Sankuru, which is his region of birth, you
Right.
still have women dressing in black because for 61 years they haven't seen the body. They weren't able to bury their grandfather,
All
their
right.
national hero properly. This means a lot.
So you talk about this being an emotional closure, but not a closure for justice. How do you see the pursuit of justice, though, for the murder of your grandfather? How will that continue?
So there is trial going on right now. So now the process is a bit long, I must say. Out of the 11 people that were accused, 9 have passed away. So we are kind of running out of time. But for us, it's very, very important that justice should be served because this is the basis of what could be a new and appeased relationship between Belgium and the Congo. Everybody wants that, but memory is very important post-conflict countries in transitional justice. So we are certainly hoping that the judicial system will take that as seriously as it is and make sure that justice will be served before these two persons pass away. Patrice Emery Lumumba is embraced largely by the youth, which is tired of seeing the fights between tribes and the fights between political parties. At the end of the day, he was a young man fighting for young people, and he passed away at 36, which was very young. So all these people feel represented by him, and that's something that you can really feel in the country.
All right. Professor Clark, now, I want to hear about the sentiment coming out of Europe, particularly from Belgium, because the timing of this return is one of those areas in focus. Why this reckoning now on the part of Belgium to return Lumumba's remains 6 decades since his assassination?
I think what Belgium is doing is part of a bigger reckoning of European colonial powers trying to come to terms with their colonial past. And we've seen Germany providing reparations in Namibia. There's a whole discussion in the UK at the moment about the legacy of British colonialism. The Belgians, I guess, are trying to catch this zeitgeist and start to deal with their own past. The more immediate event, of course, is the recent visit by Belgian King Philippe to the DRC, where he was asked numerous difficult questions about Belgian colonialism, and he used, I think, a lot of very vague language to basically avoid real accountability there. So this is part, I think, of a piecemeal Belgian attempt to deal with the past. But I think, as Anne-Marie has already suggested, that there's much further that Belgium really has to go if it wants to have an honest and full reckoning with the legacies of colonialism, the assassination of Lumumba, and the way that disrupted Congolese independence. These are all issues that I don't think Belgium has yet fully come to terms with. But Belgium hasn't quite apologized, though, for the atrocities that happened in the DRC all those years ago. Why is it so difficult to get an apology out of them? It was one of the really startling aspects of King Philippe's recent visit to Congo. It was his inability to say sorry, that he expressed all forms of vague remorse, but was entirely reluctant to use that particular word. I think this shows something very deep in Belgian culture, a real lack of willingness to categorically deal with the legacies of colonialism. This is something I think that the Belgian political and cultural elite hopes will simply go away, that if they can return some artifacts, if there can be a visit of the king to Congo, that perhaps that will satiate the Congolese population. I think what Emery has said and what we've seen so many Congolese talk about in the last few weeks is that that simply isn't enough, that the time is ripe now for Belgium to really come to terms with what happened during colonialism, the enormous damage that was done, the murder, the pillage, the theft of natural resources, all of which benefited the Belgian elite at the time, and that Belgian society continues to benefit from today. And until there is an honest reckoning and a desire for true reparations in light of all of that, I think it will leave a very sour taste in the mouth of many Congolese people.
Dr. Kandala, what's your view here, particularly, you know, on King Philip's visit to the Congo in early June? He expressed his regrets for Belgium's abuses in the Congo. He called them unjustifiable and racist, but no apology was forthcoming. I mean, what would a formal apology mean here?
I am not surprised with the attitude of the Belgium and the word used, and I might say carefully used by the King of Belgium, because they've remained stubborn in the recognition of the atrocities, many atrocities that have been committed in the DRC. This includes crimes against humanity, genocide, name it, you know, all these international crimes, most of them have been committed during, you know, the Belgium period. So they have remained stubborn in the recognition of the crimes committed in the DRC. You will recall that in 2002, the Parliamentarian Committee just adopted a theory of moral responsibility, which is just an opposition to legal responsibility. So choosing the word regret instead of apology, it means a lot. It is actually in line with the policy that they have toward, you know, the DRC. Because an apology will mean an accountability, which, you know, the Belgian government will take responsibility, legal responsibility for the crime committed in the DRC, and which in a case, whether it will go for retributive justice or restorative justice. And when it is, this is, you know, might happen anyway, if they opt for restorative justice, then an apology will mean that a recognition, official recognition of the atrocity committed in the DRC.
Professor Clark, I want to get a feeling of what this moral responsibility, though, would entail. One, because until 2 years ago, you know, statues of the Belgian King Leopold II stood in the streets of Brussels. This is the man whose rule in the Congo saw 10 million deaths, either by starvation, torture, execution, and disease in the DRC. This makes one wonder how the account of colonization has been etched the Belgian society here. What is their feeling about their role in the DRC?
I think until very recently, the dominant view in Belgium was to lionize Leopold, to really glorify the colonial period. The statues of Leopold were everywhere. The Central African Museum on the outskirts of Brussels really glorified the colonial past. It's only in the last few years that there's begun to be a bit of a change in the Belgian mentality. We've seen the refurbishment of that museum. It has a much more critical message about colonialism now. There is, of course, a commission of inquiry in Brussels that is wrapping up its work, looking at the colonial period. But this is a very late development. Really, for the best part of the last 60 or 70 years, the Belgian story has been one of denial.
Dr. Kandala, where does this leave us, though, when we talk about reparations? What is the path to follow if we are to look at reparations for, you know, a country like DRC?
Well, reparation is can only, be granted or happen when there is a prosecution. And generally, in any human right violation, even in ordinary crime, there is three basic rights for any victim. The first one is the right to know what happened, who did it, why it happened, and who did it. So the second one will be justice, where the criminal is brought to trial and sentence, get the appropriate sentence. And the last one, then we can talk about remedies. Those are three basic rights that any victim of a human rights violation has. So here we're talking about crimes against humanity, genocide. These are the crimes. And the killing of Lumumba, or the same pattern that has been used to kill Lumumba,
Right.
is the same pattern that is used to control the DRC up to now. The DRC since then have remained the most unstable state. And this is attributed to the colonial power. Their influence and what their influence in the DRC and on any other institution that is in the DRC. So when we're talking about reparation or remedies,
Right.
it takes so many forms. It can be restitution, it can be compensation, and it can take any other form as also apology. So this is why we're saying that my personal view is that even now Belgium has remained, as I've always put it, stubborn in the recognition of the atrocity committed in the DRC. And this game is only playing in the Africa because the colonial powers, they know that Africa does not have military power.
All right, and
But
we are going to look at the impact of that colonial heritage on the DRC when we come back after the break. We'll take a short break now, but do stay tuned. Talk Africa continues in a moment. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Amory Kalema Lumumba, Phil Clark, and Kandala Lupuwana are still my guests standing by. Let's continue with this discussion now. Amory, Belgium's and the US's role in the murder of Patrice Lumumba set the DRC on a path of decades of dictatorship, internal conflicts, economic plunder. We've heard from Dr. Kandala, about the impact of that colonial heritage on what is the DRC today. How much of that has affected and made the DRC what it is today?
Oh well, that's tremendous. Pretty much at every level. If we talk about corruption, if we talk about education limitation, in Congo, it was one of the only colony where people weren't allowed to pursue their studies after high school, which and when we've reached independence, it was very difficult for us to have people with enough education to run the country. And that's something that that's a path that we can clearly see up to now. The assassination of Patrice Emery Lumumba have paved the way for impunity. And and we see impunity throughout the history of the Congo, which lead people to believe that they can do whatever they want in Congo. We can also talk about the role of multinational during the colonial time and the role that multinational have now. Nowadays, we talk about corporate social responsibility,
right.
And I think that in the beginning of 2021, the European Union has adopted a new European rule in regards to the importation of minerals, which go in the right direction. But unfortunately, this is not, they don't have, they didn't incorporated elements that would allow some courts to force these companies to do as they recommend them to act.
Right, so DRC is still paying that big price. Dr. Kandala, do you think, though, that Belgium should be more proactive in stabilizing the DRC's restive regions or in social welfare of the DRC, in the words of Emery there?
Of course, Belgium has a big responsibility, to in the DRC and in the eastern part, because as I put it clearly, when we look at the pattern followed to kill the first elected prime minister of the DRC, which is Lumumba, is the same pattern that they are using right now for to control the mineral resources and to control the DRC. If the DRC is counted among the most insecure country or unstable country, it is part of that control that has been instituted or installed by the pattern. So this is what we're saying, that because of that foundation built by Belgium, which is followed, the DRC today is also among the country where there is a kind of a crisis of leadership.
Right.
And this is taken from what happened in 1960 after the independence, the killing of the first elected. So until such a time that the Belgium will play a proactive role in the DRC, in the sense that allow the people to elect. And I am also not part, or I'm not a partisan of election, because no such a person like Lumumba will come again through the ballot paper.
Right.
It is only by ear.
All right. So let me get your view here, Professor Clark, because we're now looking 60 years on. And the question, of course, here is, should we still be pinpointing blame on the Belgian colonial rulers for what is happening in the country's politics today? Many are wondering, despite being extremely mineral rich, why has it been difficult for DRC to chart its own path to stability and prosperity?
I mean, the reason that Lumumba was assassinated was that the Western powers saw him as too powerful and too independent. The Belgium, the US, the other major powers of the day showed their intentions very clearly at the time of Lumumba's assassination, which is they would not tolerate a Congolese leader who had an independent nationalist vision for what Congo could become. And that is a pattern of behavior that outside actors have continued right up until the present. And of course, it's true that this is at least partly an issue around Congolese leadership. But this is also a country that has consistently had to deal with the meddling of outside powers, Western powers interfering in the governance of the DRC, meddling in the economy, particularly of the eastern part of the country. This is a country that has never had an opportunity to completely run its political and economic affairs independently. And so that begins with colonialism through the early years of decolonization right up until the present. There's a very consistent story here. This is partly about Belgium, but it's about all sorts of other Western powers as well that have tried to fill their pockets off the back of Congolese wealth. And that, I think, is the tragedy of Congo, that this is a country that in many ways never had the opportunity that many other countries around the world have had, which is to determine their own affairs for the betterment of their own people. They've always been dealing with this international interference right up until today.
Well, Emery, Prime Minister Lumumba, he was largely seen as the embodiment of a peaceful and self-determined future, as Professor Clark has put it. If Lumumba were here today, what course do you think he would want to see the DRC take?
Pardon me, I just want briefly to come back on the previous question, just to say that, of course, there is responsibility for solidarity, but this relationship cannot be a child-parent relationship. So I just wanted to stress that any help is accepted, as long as respect of our sovereignty is observed. On your question, I think that I have difficulties to talk in the name of my grandfather, but he had a program, he has a legacy. When we are talking about him, it's not only nostalgia. He has a whole ideology. And the main thing was about this cleavage between him and Kasavubu at the time. He wanted a national state while Kasavubu, who ended up being president when he was prime minister, wanted a federal state. And his idea of nationalism was based on his disbelief of tribalism. So I think that his first mission, if he was still with us right now, would be to make sure that the country is as united as possible. My dad, Francois Emery Lumumba, said it earlier when we were at the ceremony. He said that the word should be, the anthem should be unity, 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 because we cannot afford, with such a big country, which represents 4 or 5 times the size of France, we cannot tolerate tribalism. So I think that would be his very first mission and challenge.
Professor Clark, coming to you on that point though, you know, as the first Prime Minister of independent Congo, how different do you think the DRC would have been today if Lumumba were alive?
I think the country would have been unimaginably different. And I think this is why the legacy of Lumumba lasts so powerfully in the DRC today. There's this real sense of what the independent Congo could have been. And I think Dr. Kandala said it as well, that wasn't just about Congo. Lumumba's legacy was about the continent as a whole. He was a real beacon of independent thought, of independent action, of African states taking control of their own affairs, capturing their own resources and using those for the benefit of their populations. That is really the symbolic importance of Lumumba's assassination and why the return of his tooth to DRC and the ceremonies that Amaury and his family have been involved in are so important. Because it's about, I think, a population that wants to recapture that spirit of Lumumba, wants to recapture that idea that Congo should be in charge of its own affairs, that it should have a truly nationalist vision that is about benefiting the entire population of Congo and not just a segment of it. And that, I think, is really why this return of Lumumba's remains is such a powerful moment, not just in Congo, but right across Africa as a whole.
All right, Professor Clark, Emery Lumumba, and Dr. Kandala, thank you all for joining us on the program. And that's it for this week on Talk Africa. Thank you to our guests for their insightful commentary on this subject. Amory Kulema Patrice Lumumba in Kinshasa, a conflict transformation professional specializing in human rights and transitional justice. He is also the grandson to the late Prime Minister of the DRC, Patrice Lumumba. Professor Philip Clark in London, Professor of International Politics at SOAS University of London, where he's also the co-director at the Center on Conflict Rights and Justice. And Dr. Kandala Lupuana in Johannesburg, a lecturer and PhD researcher on public international law at the University of Johannesburg. Now remember to keep the conversation going on our social media platforms on Twitter and Facebook, and also catch this and more episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. See you again next time. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Bye-bye.